Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me and us today for Sundays at Home. My name is Emma, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum, and I will be your host for today. A few housekeeping notes. Our panelists will be answering questions at the end of our conversation. You are welcome to ask your questions at any time during the program by using the Q&A function on the toolbar. You may ask your questions at any time during the presentation, but we will primarily answer them at the end of the program. Our panelists are happy to answer your questions. And with that, I would like to introduce our guests and our moderator for today. So Dr. Alison M. Parker is History Department Chair and Richards Professor of American History. She has research and teaching interests at the intersections of gender, race, disability, citizenship, and the law in U.S. history. In 2017 to 2018, Parker was an Andrew W. Mellon Advanced Fellow at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University, where she worked on her biography of the civil rights activist and suffragist Mary Church Terrell, Unceasing Militant, The Life of Mary Church Terrell, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press, and you can see that book cover on your screen. Her op-ed, When White Women Wanted a Monument to Black Mammies, appeared in the New York Times in 2020. Parker is also the author of two historical monographs, Articulating Rights, 19th Century American Women on Race, Reform, and the State, which came out in 2010, and Purifying America, Women, Cultural Reform, and Pro-Censorship Activism, 1873 to 1933, which came out in 1997. Our next panelist is Dr. Anastasia Curwood, and her scholarship focuses on the interface between private life and historical context for Black Americans in the 20th century. In particular, she studies the workings of gender in African American social, cultural, intellectual, and political history. Her first book explored marriages between middle-class African Americans in the era of the New Negro and the Great Depression. Her newest book is a biography of Congresswoman and Democratic candidate for the United States President, Shirley Chisholm. And you can see that book cover on your screen. Her work has been recognized with fellowships from the Ford Foundation, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, and the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. And finally, Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center, which was founded in 1981, and Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College. For many years, she was a visiting professor at Emory University's Institute for Women's Studies, where she taught graduate courses in women's studies. She's published a number of texts, including the one on your screen, Sturdy Black Bridges, a number of texts within African American and women's studies, which have been noted as seminal works by other scholars, including the first anthology on Black women's literature, Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature. In 1983, she became founding co-editor of Sage, a scholarly journal of Black women, which was devoted exclusively to the experiences of women of African descent. She's the past president of the National Women's Studies Association and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Our moderator today is Jasmine Daria Cannon, and she is the 2022-2024 NWHM Predoctoral Fellow in Women's History and is a first-generation college graduate, Black feminist activist, researcher, and writer who is dedicated to creating and developing intentional, compassionate spaces for intellectual and cultural diversity in the classroom, museum space, and community. She's currently a doctoral student in Rutgers University's Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department. Her research interests include Black feminist theories and praxis, 19th and 20th century African American history, digital humanities methods, and critical social justice pedagogies. We are really excited for this program today, and I would love to welcome our panelists and moderator to the screen.
Hi, y'all. So thank you, Emma, for that lovely introduction. We are so excited, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm like fangirling a bit over here because moderating a panel on Black feminist histories, and especially with Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall, is like a dream come true. And so just to preface, I have my questions on my iPad, so if y'all see me looking away or looking around, that's what I'm looking at. But to kick us off, I would love to take a slightly deeper dive into you all's journeys in doing Black feminist research, especially historical research. And I would love if you all could share your definitions of Black feminism. So I'm going to kick it off to Dr. Guy-Sheftall, who's like the icon in the room. and whose research has informed so much of all of our work. So yeah, I can.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. It makes me blush. So I have a personal familial journey to feminism and an intellectual journey. So I'll start with the intellectual journey. And my journey was probably a little bit different because it started so early and it was in a Black space. So I was working on a master's degree at Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta, as a literary studies person, doing a master's degree in English. And I ended up doing a thesis, interestingly enough, like Toni Morrison, on William Faulkner. I looked at his treatment of women in his major novels, and that threw me into the embryonic field of feminist literary studies. So I started reading all of the feminist literary criticism that was emerging. And I wrote, I didn't realize it then, a Black feminist analysis of Faulkner's treatment of women in his major novels. Hadn't had any women's studies courses, and had not read very much, if any, Black feminist theory. I mean, I had not even heard of Ida Wells Barnett, even though I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And I had not heard of Anna Julia Cooper, whom I discovered as a PhD student at Emory by accident with just my hand in the stacks. So that was the very beginning journey. And then I'll just say personally, I was actually raised by a Black feminist mother who, when I was in the 8th grade, sued the Memphis public schools so that I would not have to take the obligatory home economics course. I was embarrassed, I didn't understand, but what she was saying is that these traditional gender scripts are discriminatory. And so that would be so I didn't have to unlearn, and I didn't have to think that feminism belonged to white people.
Wow. Blown away. That was beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to kick it off and pass to Dr. Curwood next. So just to repeat the question, can you share a bit more about your journey into doing Black feminist historical research, as well as what is your definition of Black feminism?
Well, I think I will follow the lead of my distinguished colleague, Dr. Guy-Sheftall, and talk about both personal and intellectual. Personally, I was in part raised by a grandmother who was a Black woman, the first Black woman to get a college and PhD degree in her family. And so I am the second Dr. Curwood who has existed, who is a Black woman. And so that example was one thing. And the other example that I can't discount is what appears at the end of Shirley Chisholm of the biography, when I saw a photograph of Shirley Chisholm with my parents and asked them who she was, and they said, "That's Shirley Chisholm. She ran for president. You can too." And you know, after asking, well, so she's a Black woman who ran for president. Oh, okay. Then it just expanded my sense of possibility, I think, as Chisholm did for many people. Just you know, what is it that Black women can do? And what I found with Shirley Chisholm is that, and maybe this is going into the intellectual part of my explanation, people think that Black women are somehow specialized or particular or too specific to be relevant to everybody else. And when I wrote this book, I found out, if I didn't know it already, that Chisholm was incredibly universal. And in that, she saw from a Black feminist perspective simultaneity. She saw how people could come together over multiple points of who they were. And it created, she really had a universal appeal to anyone who wanted to make sure that power is fairly shared in the democracy that we have. So, I guess a very, 10,000 feet perspective of Black feminism for me is simultaneity.
Mhm.
Oh, that's beautiful. My goodness. Make me feel all warm and fuzzy on the inside. Next, I'll ask the same of Dr. Parker.
Thanks. I'll start on a personal front too, to say that my mom was a white woman who was a pioneer women's studies scholar, and who in fact brought Shirley Chisholm and Alice Walker and other people to her high school to teach the students women's history. And so she was a pretty defining influence on me. And when I was very little, she took me with her to the protests that were going on at UCLA to free Angela Davis and other political prisoners in the early 1970s. And so that's the personal interest that I had in the subject. And then as I was doing work on my second book project, which was called Articulating Rights, I was really trying to think about how Black and white women articulated political theories and thoughts about their relationship to the federal government, to the state in the 19th century, at a time when they didn't have the right to vote, and started looking at Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and at Mary Church Terrell to understand who they were and how they saw their relationship to the state. And they, especially over time, Black women pushed back on just a pure moral suasion argument, and even and for sure a states' rights argument, and started to make demands on the federal government to do things like anti-lynching legislation or suffrage and things like that. And so it was in that context that I became really interested in thinking about the way that Terrell especially articulated the kind of Black feminism that was really being created as an intersectional Black feminism in the turn of the century with people like Anna Julia Cooper and Ida B. Wells Barnett, as they talked about the fact that, as she put it, I have two handicaps to overcome, my race and my sex. And she was always trying to navigate that space between those two. And so that was what got me interested in this as a subject.
Wow, I think that's really beautiful. I think that y'all all bring up really great points about, your life being so formative to your research, whether that have been a grandparent or your mother or, just environment. And I think that it's just really a connection point for a lot of us doing this kind of research, because we don't just bring ourselves into the space. We don't just bring our big brain smartness into doing our research. We are bringing our inheritances, which include the ways that we understand our role and responsibility to do the work. And so I will also segue to the next question with that. So in doing this Black feminist historical research, one thing that I'm learning is that with Black feminist politics, it requires a certain way of being and way of listening to the archive. It involves a very specific set of political role and responsibility in doing the work and doing it well. And so my next question is, in what ways, what lessons have you learned from the women that you've studied about the role and responsibility of a researcher doing Black feminist histories? So I will, I want it to feel like a conversation. And so I don't want it to be name calling, but I will pass it to Dr. Curwood, whose book is out most recently, with your book on Shirley Chisholm coming out just this past month, right?
Yeah, it was officially out January 10th, but it feels like the blink of an eye ago. And I feel a sense of deep responsibility to the Black feminists and Black women I write about, to first of all, uphold the vision that they have shown me about how to create freedom for everybody. And the second thing is to tell the truth. The distortions in history, we're fighting it right now. Nation in certain states that are getting press, but nationwide, this contest over the truth, over the historical truth, and over historical memory. The antidote is Black feminism, because from this vantage point of Black women who see that Blackness, womanness, then sometimes and class, sexuality, age, ability, that the people who are on the downside of power bound binaries are losing out when in the story that those with the power are telling. Then an antidote is telling that story. So let me just give you a quick example from Shirley Chisholm's life. When she went to Congress for the first time, she was looking for housing in the district, and she called a real estate agent, and it was available. Guess what? She showed up to look at the apartment. Suddenly it wasn't available anymore. Then it came to light that she was a congresswoman. Suddenly it was available again. Oh no, that was a mistake. Our records were wrong. And she, what she did was she said, no, thanks. I'm not taking this apartment. And she went on to live actually with another Black woman, a nurse from Freedman's Hospital at Howard. So she did not sue anybody at that point, but she continued to fight for government policies that created equality. But then when she was joined in Congress by a couple of new Black women in 1973, Yvonne Brathwaite Burke and Barbara Jordan were sworn in. Cardis Collins came in not long after, when her husband passed away and she took his expired term. And there was this newspaper story about comparing Chisholm to Jordan and Brathwaite Burke. And Chisholm was not as smart as Jordan and not as pretty as Brathwaite Burke. So, and this is why she was not as worthy. And then the article said, we can imagine that if Chisholm was denied housing in Washington, D.C., she would start picketing. Because I guess Brathwaite Burke had run into trouble renting an apartment. She would start a big demonstration and start picketing and make a racket. And the truth was that she was denied, and that's part of her experience. And it's such a I could see everybody's expression when I started telling a story. It's such a story that just is universal. But she did not. She went into the government and worked against discrimination in a systemic sense. So I'm going to stop there because I've been going for a long time. But that kind of truth telling and learning the whole truth is bedrock to my sense of responsibility and what I try to do.
Nice, thank you. And I greatly appreciate that story. Get Dr. Curwood's book. Yes. Love to learn some more about Shirley Chisholm. So yes, I will pass it on to Dr. Guy-Sheftall.
Boy, I learned so much. I think I want to briefly just focus on what I learned that stuck with me the most, and that was the unrelenting, radical resistance of these women. And I want to go back to the 19th century. They did not care about being criticized. I mean, I'm thinking about Ida Wells Barnett, who was going to publish something about inappropriate behavior among Black ministers. And they tried to chastise her. And she says, if you keep talking, I'm going to publish your names in my newspaper. And so one of the things that I learned was you can't care about what people think about you, because if you are engaged in radical Black feminist talk, it's going to be truth telling. And one of the things that's going to get you in the most trouble is what you say about our intra-racial issues. In other words, you can talk about white supremacy till the cows come home. It's when you turn that gaze internally that you have to have tremendous courage. And then I'll say one other thing. It's very clear now that the Black feminist writing that has been produced is what is causing the most difficulty among the right wing. Those are the women, Black feminist writers, who were taken off the African-American, the College Board's African-American Studies. That's not accidental. It's Black feminist writing that's come off. It's not Du Bois and all of the other men who dominated African-American political discourse. It is radical Black feminist writing. And so it just reminded me of how radical we've been and how we have to keep being radical, because it is so disturbing to the status quo.
Whew. I know y'all saw me make that face, so I'm sorry. I try to control myself. But I'll pass it to Dr. Parker.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I mean, I do think that it's really important that we do take a lot of care and responsibility when we tell these stories. And one of the things that I think is so important is to know that the women, including Mary Church Terrell, wanted her story told. You know, she wrote her own autobiography. She saved every paper she could. You know, Chisholm wrote her own autobiographies. These are things that these women had a passion for history and for preserving that history. And, you know, even her idea in 1897 to ask, to put forward a resolution when she got on the board as the first Black woman on the DC Board of Education, she said, let's create a Frederick Douglass Day. But interestingly enough, when she wrote about it, she said, what I want people to know is about his abolitionism and his suffrage, support for women's suffrage, universal suffrage. And so for her, it was a way to highlight the fact that Black women and Black men needed the right to vote. So she was thinking even of that day as a day that wasn't just to celebrate a Black man, but was to celebrate some of those key issues that were so incredibly important to her. And thinking about the fact that she worked with the Library of Congress to make sure that her records were saved there, and was also writing a pageant and having it performed in the DC public schools by Black children on Phyllis Wheatley. So this notion of our feminist Black foremothers that she's really explicitly talking about, and that's something that I think is really important. And what we're trying to do here is to share the stories that they tried to tell and did tell, and then want others to tell too. So that's what I would add.
Wow, thank y'all. I mean, these are just so many gems. Our roles and responsibilities, including telling the truth, not caring what people have to say about what we have, about what we're saying about the truth, and making sure that our stories are preserved so that future generations can, and taken care of so that future generations can read them and follow their own dreams and change the status quo in the ways that need to continue to be changed. And so I appreciate y'all bringing up your books so much, as in Shirley Chisholm and Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells, so much, because we were talking right before this started and about my next question, which is the roles of biography in preserving women's history. And so with my pre-doc position with the National Women's History Museum, I've had the great joy of practicing and flexing my skills on writing critical biographies. I went to the Association of Black Women's Historians Symposium in December, and I sat through the Living Legends Luncheon, and Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham was like, we need to keep writing biographies. Like, she just explained in this wonderful way how important biographies were to writing women's histories. And so I was like, it finally clicked for me, a budding researcher, that the power that the biography has. And so I'm gonna signal to Dr. Parker and Dr. Curwood, and then of course, Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall, because I know you supervised a student and you wrote the credits for the Anna Julia Cooper bio. But can you all discuss a bit more why you felt it was really important to do these book-length biography projects and to inspire your students to do book-length projects for Mary Church Terrell and Shirley Chisholm?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I mean, one of the things that I found really shocking when I started looking into Terrell, when I was just trying to write a chapter about her, and I thought, oh, I'll just read all the biographies about her and then I'll be done. And there were no full-length scholarly biographies of Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women from 1896, and a co-founder along with Ida B. Wells, the only two Black women who were co-founders of the NAACP. And I was just absolutely shocked, to be honest. And because I was so drawn to her thought and her ideas, that's really what got me started. But part of it was, there were also, it turns out, over a dozen children's and teen books, biographies of her. And so I read all of those. And I was also really surprised and interested by the narrative, which I completely ended up disagreeing with. But that was this narrative that she started out as this kind of conservative woman who was all about representing respectability, the respectability politics argument. And then she became radicalized in her old age when she didn't care anymore about respectability. And it just didn't sound right. It's a nice narrative arc, and it's a kind of nice story for kids, but it doesn't make any sense. It's kind of like the idea that Rosa Parks just sat on the bus and that she was tired and old, and she was only 42 or 43. And of course, you know, she wasn't just sitting there because it just was a whim. And so I started to think about it. And, you know, then when I found that quote eventually from Paul Robeson, when he was giving her eulogy and called her an unceasing militant in the Black freedom struggle, then I knew that I had, you know, my way in to really trying to explain that her activism was there in that more direct militant way, along with, you know, these attempts to outreach and to build networks and work in interracial networking and the whole deal, but just to try to understand that. So I think what a biography lets you do, because you have more space, is you can try to create a less one-dimensional, more three-dimensional picture, and one that brings together the personal and the private to try to explain and understand how these personal lives actually shaped their political ambitions and their ideas and their goals. And so that's really what it's all about from my perspective.
Oh, thank you. I love that, unceasing militant. I will pass it to Dr. Curwood.
Well, I came from the school of thought where, you know, I need to write something that talks about a big group of people to be significant and, you know, draws these large conclusions. And I tried to do that with my first book, Stormy Weather, about marriages. Well, talk about intimate, that this is how I got interested in how people's everyday lives and how people as human beings interact with historical circumstances. Because it's never as simple as, oh yeah, well, this person lived through Jim Crow, so they, you know, their life was XYZ. Everybody brings together so much specificity, and then there's temperament. and luck and happenstance and just the crazy way that everybody's lives come together. So that writing that first book really got me interested in biography, and I taught a course on biography in an upper level undergraduate seminar, and I was looking for biographies to teach in that course. And like Dr. Parker, I thought, okay, well, what's a good biography of Shirley Chisholm that I can teach? And I couldn't find it. I found all these young adult books and kids books, and then her memoirs. But what's in her memoir gets taken as, as everything. And she and/or her ghostwriter introduced some factual errors in that memoir, which, as we know as historians, autobiography and memoir we do not expect them to be mirrors and objective accounts of somebody's life. So I decided that I had to write it, and I was already interested in writing biography because of that intersection between people's lives and history. And then the thing about Shirley Chisholm is that there was a narrative about her life as, so she was seen as a militant, uncompromised, unbought and unbossed, never sacrificed anything to her ideals, just ran for president because she wanted to take a moonshot to win. And what I found was, she had strong ideals. Her strong ideals connect with these ideas about Black feminism of sharing power among an intersectional group of people. But her actual life is way more interesting than her just as a symbol. She's a really complicated person. And so what I love about doing this biography is that I saw that she is fully human and she's amazing and heroic at the same time. So I think, I really like that Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham is urging us to do biographies, because we need to illustrate the humanity of Black women, and the fact that you can deal with incredibly challenging historical circumstances, big historical moments, and still be human. And that's a lesson for us now.
Lovely, thank you. And Dr. Guy-Sheftall, I know, I don't know if you have any specific comments, but I did.
I want to just say a few things. When I started teaching many years ago at Emory, I was going to write a biography of Anastasia Cooper, and I decided in that course that there was a student there, Vivian May, who should write that biography. She could read Anastasia Cooper's dissertation in French, which I could not. And one of the things that I would say is true of Anastasia Cooper, unlike Terrell and Ida Wells, there were no children's book, there was nothing, almost even no essay. So she was very unknown. And I still don't understand how someone who lived from 1859 to 1964, and who was, in my opinion, one of the most important Black women intellectuals of that period, was vacant, absent, and so forth. And so Vivian May took that challenge on. I'll just say very, very briefly, I've been working on a very long biographical essay of Coretta Scott King. Now, you're talking about somebody who is invisible to the public, except as Martin's widow. And what I've discovered about her is unbelievable. She was, I would say, the most passionate LGBTQ activist of that generation, civil rights generation. And so I have finished the essay. It's about 80 pages. Somebody else needs to do a long biography, but I'm trying to recover her, situate her outside of the space where she is. And it reminds me very much, which my panelists have said, of what happened to Ida Wells. We get stripped of our radicalness, our resistance, and put in this little sweet, nice box. And Coretta Scott King has fallen into that category too.
Oof, beautiful. So what y'all are saying is there's still a whole world of work to be done on preserving Black women's histories through book-length biographies. So I know that we have a lot of researchers probably watching. And so wink, wink, we all got some work to do. And so I have one more question before I start directing us to the Q&A. So for folks who are in the, who are watching us live, if you all have some questions to put in the Q&A, please use the Q&A function as Emma has suggested in the chat. And feel free to ask as many questions as you can. We'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have left. And so my final question before we transition is basically to just preface you all, and I'm sure Emma will probably plug this later, but the National Women's History is about to launch their first big in-person exhibition at MLK Library in DC on Black feminism in DC, and it's titled We Who Believe in Freedom. And several of the women that you all have mentioned and that you have researched will be featured in that exhibition, including Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, and even further into the 20th century, Shirley Chisholm, Eleanor Holmes Norton, just an amazing list of Black feminists who have either lived or learned or organized in DC. And so my last question is, we know that many Black feminists have spent time in DC, again, living, learning, working throughout their careers, either born and raised or as students and activists. So can you all share how DC has been this, like a little bit more about how DC has been this really pivotal place in fostering Black feminist activism and intellectualism throughout the course of the 19th and 20th centuries? So that's a kind of a big question, but I will push to Dr. Guy-Sheftall first.
Well, you know, one immediately goes to Anastasia Curwood, who came to, and Mary Church Terrell, who came to work at M Street High School. So M Street High School in DC was probably, and you know, a major site for the production of Black intellectual activism and teaching. And I'll just mention, because I'm really interested in my panels who talk about those biographies, I might just think about somebody like Loretta Ross, who did the anti-rape, who worked on the first battered women's shelter in DC. And I think it would have been easier to do that work in DC, for example, than in the Deep South, where many of these women came from, like Memphis or Mississippi. So I would say that DC was a hub. It's in the nation's capital, huge middle-class population, Howard University. And so I think that all of that made DC not surprising place.
Cool, thank you. Dr. Parker?
Yeah, I would echo all of that and say that for Mary Church Terrell, the fact that all the national conventions for every organization came through and had their conferences in DC was crucial, because she was able to connect all the time with people from all over the country. So that's a really big part of the political activism. And then also, she lobbied in the halls of Congress on a regular basis. She would go there from the 1890s on. She was there all the way up until 1950s in the hall. She knew every part of that building and every segregated cafeteria that was there. So there was that. And then on top of it, she went and met with almost every president too. And so these were moments and experiences that you couldn't have if you weren't in the national capital. So there is something valuable about being in that space. And it does bring, you know, and incredible women who end up running for politics and becoming politicians, so we can move over to Chisholm with that, but I'll stop with there.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Curwood?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Parker, for tossing it to me. DC, so DC is a chocolate city, and DC is where power is seated in this country. And for Black feminists who are really questioning the fundamental relationships about power, DC is a logical place to go. So, in Shirley Chisholm's case, it is the logical place to go, because that's where, if she wants to be in politics, that's where she knew she would have the widest impact, and she did. But she didn't necessarily expect to run for president when she got to DC, but she knew that the next step, she got elected from Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, and so that was where she went. Now, I say that, not only was Shirley Chisholm the first Black woman to serve in Congress, but Shirley Chisholm was the first congressperson to bring Black feminism to Capitol Hill. And so that's a really important distinction, because she's there in her person as a Black woman, and then she is bringing Black feminist ideas to the floor of the House of Representatives. And she's practicing Black feminism alongside the women in Words of Fire, in the, I can't remember what number chapter it is, but, in that late 60s, early 70s period, she's in Congress when those women are writing those just foundational essays. And she's reading them. I know this because I saw her copy of The Black Woman, and she made a note of when she read it inside the front cover. She's very, very deliberately bringing those ideas when she's arguing about welfare rights, when she's arguing about extending Social Security and minimum wage protections to domestic workers, when she's making sure that women are included in vocational training, when she's trying to get the Equal Rights Amendment through, when she's refusing to authorize any military spending bills if funding is not restored to domestic programs. All of those things she's bringing as a result of the Black Feminist Foundation she had through reading, and the Black Feminist Foundation she had through watching her mother and her grandmother and interacting with the women in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a Black neighborhood in New York. So it's if you want to undermine power, the patriarchal white supremacy, DC is where you go.
Great. Thank you so much. And before I transition to the Q&A, thank you all for just bringing us those lovely threads about Black feminist visions of what true liberation is for all of us. And in a lot of ways, we did this. Y'all were just amazing in how you did this, but we talked about 150 years of Black feminists informing how we are thinking about power and our individual rights and justice and, telling our stories through right now, even if we don't know exactly where we got the ideas from or who was the first person to say it. I appreciate that y'all are all continuing to do the work to let us know that Black feminism, I think you said earlier, that Black feminism is the antidote. I think that's what you said. And so I'm going to transition to the Q&A. We have a couple of questions in here. And so Emma, did you want me to read them off, or did you want to do that?
Oh, I can handle this part. You have done, because some of the questions are for you as well, Jasmine. And I just want to thank you all again so much for walking us through all this history and being so just so overwhelming in what you have to say. It's been really wonderful to be sitting here and listening. So first off, a question, but one of our audience members, and I'm also looking off because I'm looking at a separate screen with the chat and the questions, but one of our audience members actually met Shirley Chisholm in the 1980s, just before she joined with the Commission for Women in Montgomery County, Maryland. So I just wanted to share that. We've got a very interested audience. But just to kind of start with the first question. So Elaine is wondering, what are some of the other Black women who need full-length biographies? I'd love to ask this question to all of you. And it could either be ones that you yourself want to write, or maybe that you would think other people should write. So how about Dr. Parker, we can start there and we can kind of popcorn around.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about is not necessarily even biographies, but for example, Susan Goodyear is doing some really amazing work in New York State to track and find all of the Black suffragists. And these are people who in some ways are not famous at all. But what she's trying to do is find out who were the average women who were suffragists. And then she's connecting them to all the other clubs and groups and organizations that they were involved with. And they see the networking and all of that. And I think that would be incredibly valuable to do in many other states, just to try to understand more ground level work in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, as well as, so some of these ideas about women being bridge leaders or movement leaders in certain kinds of ways. Well, what was it like back then, as opposed to in the civil rights movement proper after World War II? And so that's one thing that I was thinking about.
Thank you for sharing. I'm aware of Professor Goodyear's work, but and I know she's written about white feminists, so white suffragists, I should say. So it's interesting to. I'm excited to hear that she's writing another book. Professor Curwood, same question. Black woman who needs a book-length biography?
Yeah, so who doesn't, first of all? Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall needs a biography. I mean, we have so many Black women who despite being human, have also accomplished heroic things. Now, I see a question in the chat about, has anyone looked at the impact of women in music? And that reminds me that there are some Black women writing biographies of Black women now. There's actually an informal collective of Black women writing Black women. And so one of the biographers, K.T. Ewing of Tennessee State, is writing about Alberta Hunter. Also Memphis. We haven't talked about these Memphis connections. It seems like the Memphis connections are very strong here. There are other scholars in that group who are writing about Erica Huggins. That's Mary Phillips writing about Erica Huggins of the Black Panthers. So, obviously Huey and Bobby get all the attention, but who was running that school that the Black Panthers had in Oakland that was pedagogically and politically innovative? It was Erica Huggins. There's also Queen Mother Audley Moore, Ashley Farmer's writing about her. There's not Mary McLeod Bethune. So Mary McLeod Bethune is also the subject of Kim Phillips's work, and she's working on that. There are so many, and here's the thing is, so Tanisha Ford is working on a woman whose name I can't even remember, but we'll remember it after she writes this book, who was seen as a socialite in New York City, putting together NAACP events, but she's actually a political operative. And so, when you look beneath the surface of these women's lives, you see the substance that is behind the symbol. And there's just so much more that's there. Finally, I wanted to mention C. Dolores Tucker, because the person who wrote in, I bet the person who wrote in, who met Congresswoman Chisholm in the 80s, might have been involved in the National Black Women's Political Congress of Black Women, which was an organization that Chisholm co-founded after she left Congress, and was the training ground for a generation of Black women in politics. Maxine Waters was involved, Donna Brazile was involved. And so there's a whole host of women there. Really, it's endless. And then how many biographies does Abraham Lincoln have? So maybe some of these women should have more than one biography.
So it seems like there's a lot of really exciting work that is about to come out imminently, and then so much more work that should be done. So thank you. Professor Guy-Sheftall, same question. The next Black woman who needs a book-length biography.
Let me just, following that, Mary Helen Washington is working on a biography of Paul Marchant, and she's having very big challenges. Just finding a lot of personal material. But surprisingly, Dorothy Height does not have a biography, which is amazing. And I'll just mention this one person. There are many local people, but I want to mention Rosalind Pope. We just got through celebrating the 63rd anniversary of the Atlanta Student Movement. And she was the one that crafted the document. And she lived to be 84, and she died a few weeks ago. Someone like Rosalind Pope that may not be known outside of Georgia. And some of her work got attributed to Julian Bond. So somebody like Rosalind Pope would be another person that I would put there, and a lot of local folk who didn't have national visibility. And I would say, following up, we need more biographies of Anna Julia Cooper, because Vivian focused primarily on her writing. So I would say many of these women need more than one. I agree.
Thank you for that. And Jasmine, you mentioned that you were writing so many biographies as part of your predoctoral fellowship with the National Women's History Museum. So I'd love to hear your answer to this question as well. Who would you love to write a biography on?
Well, I think one person that I wrote a biography on that I think she deserves a book-length project is Ophelia Settle Egypt. She was absolutely amazing and had like 3 different careers as teaching and preserving the histories of enslaved people through anthropological studies, and spending time between New York and DC and North Carolina, and going back and forth between North and South, and even going to St. Louis for a while to do some relief work. I think that she had such an amazing story, and I think I would love to see book length on her. And then another person I'm surprised that we don't have a book length project on is Sadie Tanner Moselle Alexander. I think like a really beautiful story. Also has a North Carolina connection because she worked at it's not Mechanics and Farmers Bank, but North Carolina Mutual Insurance, which was like one of the oldest Black insurance companies in the country, before going to earn her PhD. So she's like one of the first Black women PhDs in the US, but out of Penn. And I think that story with a piece of Philly history that we sometimes forget is like how concentrated Black elite were at one point in the city. I think I'm just surprised that we don't have more than like an article about her as like a legal scholar, as an economist. So yeah, those are my 2 people that I'd like to offer.
Well, thank you for sharing those. And the National Women's History Museum does have biographies on Dorothy Height and Ophelia Settle Egypt that if you are interested, you can read before those book projects come out at some future point. So then the next question that we have from Nancy is kind of more of a question about your all experience. And Professor Guy-Sheftall, it was in response to when you were talking about how in college, there weren't any women's studies courses that you could take. And I'd love to expand this out to ask all of you about kind of what the lay of the land was with women in gender studies when you were all going through college and your PhD, and how that's kind of changed since you all have been, professors. So Professor Guy-Sheftall, we'll start with you.
Well, okay, like everybody who would have gone to college between 1962 and 1966, no women's studies, no attention to Africa or Black studies. I mean, it was a Eurocentric, phallocentric curriculum, even as an English major. I didn't read any women writers. So 1962 to 1966, was a wasteland. There's no comparison now, between, even when I was a PhD student at Emory, there's no comparison between that situation and the proliferation of doctoral programs in African American studies and women's studies, and thousands of programs and courses throughout the academy.
Thank you. Professor Curwood?
Could I mention just one thing that getting back to biographies, I wrote a review of Paula Giddings' Ida Wells biography for Ms., and I sat there and read it all in one day. And one of the things that I learned, which I was stunned by, speaking of Memphis, my great-grandfather worked very closely with Ida Wells Barnett in Memphis. And this is never mentioned in the family. And so I was just amazed that I had a family connection to Ida Wells Barnett and didn't know it.
That's really remarkable. So I'm sorry, I just got so distracted that I forgot what your question was.
No worries. The question from Nancy was basically, about women's studies.
I remember.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I mean, I think one of the things that we should remember, it's because of basically the civil rights movement and the feminist movement that we have all of these departments and classes and programs to begin with, because it was the students who protested. They took over administration buildings. They demanded having these disciplines put in place. And so, it is actually very interesting that in Florida, one of the bills right now, or interesting is probably the bad word to use, horrifying, is that there's an attempt to ban, it hasn't passed yet, to be clear, but there's an attempt to ban gender studies from universities. So this initial attack on so-called CRT in the classrooms has moved on into, high school classrooms is moved on into a more frontal assault on the universities. And so that's something that we really need to be careful and watch out, because it's not going to stay in Florida. And, this is something that really all these generations of people fought for, so that when I was in college in the 80s, there were women's studies programs, and, you could take African American studies, all of that existed. And that's due to the fighting that everyone did before then. So we can't be complacent about this right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And that call to attention as well, Professor Parker. And Professor Curwood, same question for you.
I just keep thinking about how these critiques that Black feminists have had are they get exactly to the heart of what's going on and create so much fear among those, autocrats and people who want to undermine democracy. And so much that so the question, so I went, when I went to college in the 90s, you could take women's studies, Black studies, or Black studies. So that was it, right? So as far as teachings of Black feminism, it was really hard to find. But at that stage, I was there just a few years after Deborah Gray White's "Aren't I a Woman" was published, and that book rocked my world, because I could see how to bring women's studies and Black studies together. I couldn't take a class that would do that. But there were texts, because of this generation of scholars before me, there were texts that I could go to. And reading that very early in my college career was absolutely a game changer. And so that's where I was. It even as recently as in the early 2000s, it was sort of remarkable to find options in college classrooms that would do all those things together. So, as we grow Black feminist histories, we build more practitioners. The future Dr. Cannon is one of them. And so, we just need to keep mentoring each other and lifting the work of each other up.
Could I mention something right quick? Getting back to the question, another person who needs a biography is Margaret Murray Washington. One of the people that was married to Booker Washington, but that's not why I'm saying it. And one of the things I want to say here is when I start the history of women's studies and Black studies, which of course probably I'm the only one who does that, she taught a course at Tuskegee on women in the world. This was a women's studies, Black studies course at Tuskegee back in the 30s. So Margaret Murray Washington really, really needs to a biography, and I put her as a foremother of Black women's studies, and the course was global.
Wonderful. So again, so much work that hopefully someone in our audience will feel compelled to take on. So we are actually over time, and I'm not going to be able to get to the remaining questions, but and part of me wants to ask one more question for all of you, if you're willing to give me a few more minutes, but to kind of leave our audience with a final take-home message. And if you can distill it down, I would love to hear from each of you. What is the main message that you would love to leave our audience with today? And Jasmine, I'd love to start with you.
Oh, thank you. I think that my main message that I hope you all take away from this discussion is that all this history, as distant as it might feel, it's not that far away. And so it's actually within our reach. And so to preface this, when I started PhD school, and I'm a direct, beneficiary of Dr. Guy-Sheftall's work, Dr. Brooks Higginbotham's work, Dr. Deborah Gray White's work, those folks who are formative to my research, like I took a class with Dr. Deborah Gray White, Paula Giddings and all them, they were at ABWH. I was able to breathe the same air as people who were formative in creating this field that I get to contribute to. And so, if there are other people who are also still are Black women doing their PhDs, the grounding piece of advice I got, which was like, you're really fourth generation Black woman PhD. It's only a few, right? And so all that stuff is within reach, and any ways that you can pay homage to the ways that Black feminism and Black feminists are actively and passively informing your thinking about how to do this tricky thing we call life. Make sure to pay your thanks and cite your sources, and let folks know that all the ways Black feminism has transformed you. So that's my piece.
That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Professor Parker, the main message you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think one thing that we can really learn from studying these women in the past is that change is something that we have to continually be fighting for, and that we have to be both militant and persistent and resilient, and that we can't give up because we see new obstacles, but that instead we can look back at the examples of these amazing feminist foremothers and see it as something that we can do in our new generations. But sometimes I think that we get this sense that things have to happen immediately, and if they don't, then you just have to give up. And I would say that these women all give us an example of perseverance.
Thank you for sharing that. Professor Curwood, what is the main message you'd like to leave our audience with? Oh, you're still muted.
Sorry. It's going to happen once each meeting. Mediocrity and mediocrity has power, and so does excellence. And what I mean by that is that the women we've been talking about have been dealing with power held by mediocre people for generations. It's not going to go away. It's persistent, as Dr. Parker's protagonists are as well. But it just takes, it doesn't take being a superhero to cause change. Although you could argue that simply causing change makes you a superhero, no matter whether you feel like one or not. So I wrote in the introduction of Shirley Chisholm, it's hard to demystify our heroes. Still, we need to demystify our heroes and see our heroes as human, so that the humans of the future can see themselves as heroes, because we need you.
And again, another wonderful message of persistence, and also recognizing that you have a role to play, even if you have self-doubt. I think that's such an important message. And Professor Guy-Sheftall, the final word, main message you'd like to leave our audience.
I would like to have our audience engage in some action right this minute. The Afro-American Policy Forum, under the direction of Kimberly Crenshaw, is mounting a mobilization against all of the things that we've mentioned, that is the getting rid of Black feminist texts. And so I want us to act. We need more signatures. Go on the Afro-American Policy Forum website, sign up. We're having a teach-in May 3rd. We're in very dangerous times, and we need to resist and respond the way those women that we've talked about do. And so you can do that right now. Afro-American Policy Forum, there's a wonderful analysis of the Black feminists that have been banned, and discussion of their works and their photographs. So that's what I would like for us to do, in addition to everything else.
I think that's a wonderful place to end it on, is not only with these really central and uplifting messages, but a call to action. So thank you all again so much for your time, your expertise, your words of wisdom. Thank you, Jasmine, for being such a wonderful moderator. And thank you all to our audience for staying with us, for asking such wonderful questions. And please do keep up with the National Women's History Museum's website for all of our upcoming biographies on many of the women we talked about today, and our inaugural exhibit at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in DC, which is opening on March 30th, the end of this month. So again, Professor Parker, Professor Curwood, Professor Guy-Sheftall, and Jasmine, thank you again so much for your time. This was absolutely wonderful. And to everyone, I hope you have a good and healthy rest of your Sunday. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
nice
you.
seeing everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.